They rang the famous bells she had founded with her own hands and called the work another man's. And the young woman stood silent at the back of the cold tower in a plain grey gown, while a knot of fashionable strangers praised the wonder of Marchmont, and never once said that the ring was hers. And they would not have believed her if she had, for they had been told she was nothing at all. Not even a daughter of the house, only a base-born ward the dead earl had taken in out of pity. They had taken her house and her father's name, and the great estate that was hers, and the very work of her own years, and when even that was not enough, they had taken the one thing no thief should have been able to take, which was her blood. They had stood up before the whole county and said that her own father had never truly been married to her mother at all, and the county had believed them, because it is always easier to believe a lord and a lady than a silent girl in a grey gown. And Aurelia Sandys let them, and kept her face still, and went on keeping by her own hand the great ring of bells her father had founded, and that no one else in all the county knew how to voice, because she had learned that a wronged woman with no money and no protector and no name the world would credit has exactly two possessions left to her: her silence and her work. And she did not yet know that the great tenor in the tower, which had hung silent and cracked and unmoved since it tolled at her father's funeral 3 winters before, was about to be brought down at last and turned over to the bright daylight before the very people who had robbed her, and that the cold, proud man who was about to walk into the churchyard to buy the famous ring would be standing there to see what her father had cast inside it. It was a bright cold morning in the last week of January when the cold Marquess of Stoneleigh came to Marchmont to hear the famous bells. And that morning is where I will begin, though Aurelia's story begins long before it. For everything that had been done to her over 3 slow years was about to be undone by the lowering of a single bell and a man exacting enough to listen where no one else had thought to listen. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Aurelia's story, the whole of it. The stolen name and the burned will, and the suppressed register, and the cold room over the dairy, and the great bell that kept her father's truth in the dark of the tower, and the cold, proud man who came to buy from a thief and stayed to find a wronged woman so settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young woman who has been called nobody's daughter for 3 years, and made to keep in silence the very bells she helped to found, is about to be made plain before the very people who could not be troubled to ask her a single question. And what she does when at last her father's bell speaks her name aloud to the whole county is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how the Trueborn daughter of an earl came to be standing silent at the back of her own church tower in a servant's apron while a knot of fashionable people admired her own stolen work, you have to understand what had been done to Aurelia Sandys, and what she had been told she was, and what the world had been made to believe of her. For the better part of 3 long years, she had been the only child of the late Earl of Marchmont, a learned and gentle and rather solitary man who cared more for the deep old crafts of his hands and the antiquities of his county than for the great world that bowed to his title. And she had grown up the cherished daughter of a great house, with the run of a long workshop full of her father's tools and a great church tower where his finest bells hung, and the unthinking certainty of the well-loved child that the world was a safe place, and that she was somebody in it. Her own mother had died when Aurelia was very small, and so it had been father and daughter together at Marchmont through her growing up. And the Earl had raised her himself, and had done one thing for his daughter that no one else among the great families of the county would have thought to do for a girl. He had seen, when she was very young, that she had it, that rare patient genius for the craft he loved, that she could hear the whole turning chord of a ring of bells in her mind at once, and feel the false note in a casting through the soles of her feet before she could name it. And better, could stand over a rough new bell still warm from the pit, and with a hammer and a sure ear bring it true, paring the thick bronze a little here and a little there until a thing that had merely clanged became a thing that sang in tune with all its fellows. And instead of calling it a strange unwomanly taste and steering her toward the harp and the sampler, he had taken it seriously. He had taught her the deep crafts of the bell founder, the molding of the great loam cores and the cope, the mystery of the alloy and the heat of the metal, the long fine discipline of tuning that even most founders never truly master, and then, when she had outrun even what he could teach her, he had let her teach him, and had stood by her at the tuning bench through the quiet candlelit evenings while she brought bells true that he could not have brought true alone, and had told her, more than once, in the plain certain voice she remembered all her life, that a bell speaks the truth to a whole county at once and cannot be made to lie. That anyone might own a famous peal, but that the truth of a bell comes up out of the hands that cast and tuned it, and cannot be faked or bought or stolen. And that she had it, and must never let anyone tell her she did not. She had believed him, because she was happy, and because it was true. And of all the things her father made, there was one work that was theirs above the rest, the chief glory of Marchmont and the wonder of the antiquarian world. For over many slow years the Earl and his daughter had refounded and voiced together, bell by bell and note by note, the great Marchmont ring of 8, that did what no other peal in the county could do. They hung in the squat grey Norman tower of the old estate church, 8 bells from the small bright treble to the deep tenor, and where the old ring had been a sweet enough jangle that had never quite agreed among themselves, the Earl and his daughter had brought them, one by one, into a perfect tuned accord, so that when they were rung the whole 8 spoke together in a chord so true and so grand that men who knew bells came from 30 miles to hear them, and said there was not a finer ring in England. And the tenor, the great deep bell that was the foundation of them all, the Earl had cast last and best of all, with his own failing hands and his daughter beside him, in the last years of his life, and no one then alive, standing in the churchyard to hear the great ring of Marchmont roll out over the winter fields, could have guessed that the proof of who Aurelia truly was, and whose estate Marchmont was, lay hidden in the body of that very tenor bell, set there by a dying man against the day his daughter would have need. For the late Earl of Marchmont was a careful man as well as a clever one, and he had reason, late in his life, to be very careful indeed. The trouble had begun, as such troubles so often do, with a marriage. The Earl's first wife, Aurelia's mother, had been a gentlewoman of no great family, the learned daughter of a poor country parson who had shared the Earl's love of old things. And the Earl had married her young and abroad and quietly, against the loud will of his proud people, who thought her far beneath him and never forgave the match, and when she died young, leaving him only the one small daughter, the family had let it be understood that the less said of that unfortunate foreign marriage the better. The Earl had borne their coldness for his daughter's sake, but he was a solitary man grown lonely, and some years on, when Aurelia was near grown, he had done a thing that he thought a comfort and that gave his enemies their opening, for he had married a second time, a handsome managing widow of the county with a grown son of her own, and being a private man who loathed a fuss and meant to set his affairs in order in his own good time, he had not yet drawn up and proved the new will he intended, the will that would have set his daughter's birthright beyond all reach, when his health began suddenly and sharply to fail. And that unfinished business, the unproved will and the quiet foreign first marriage that only a page of a parish register could prove, became, when the spring he had counted on did not come for him, the very crack through which his widow's people would pour to take everything his daughter had. For the great estate of Marchmont and the whole of the late Earl's fortune did not, as it happened, pass by any entail to a fixed male heir, but lay in the Earl's own gift to leave, settled only so far that an older marriage settlement, made when he wed his second wife, had charged the estate with a handsome jointure for the widow during her life and was to fall, after her, to the heirs of the Earl's own body, and the Earl had meant, by the new will he never proved, to provide his daughter outright and cut that settlement down to the modest provision he had truly intended for his wife. But the new will was never proved, and the old settlement stood, and so everything came to turn on the one question it could not answer of itself, which was whether Aurelia was, in the eye of the law, the heir of her father's body at all, or whether she could be made into nothing, a base-born ward with no claim, so that the widow might keep the whole estate for her life under the jointure, and rule it, and strip it, and set up her own son as master, and marry that son in time to the distant cousin who would have the bare reversion, and so draw Marchmont, by the long patient theft of a lifetime, clean into her own blood. And the late Earl's widow had understood all this, and had watched, and had waited. The Dowager Countess of Marchmont Almeria was a handsome, cold, managing woman of about 52, who had married the Earl for his name and his estate and not one particle of love, and had brought to the match a grown son of her first marriage, and a fixed unshakable conviction that Marchmont and its fortune ought, by every right she chose to recognize, to come at last to her own people, and had been, all the short years of her marriage, merely waiting out a soft bookish earl who cared more for his mouldering bells than for the disposing of his lands. And her son, Mr. Julian Frost, the child of her first husband and no blood whatever of the Earl's, was an idle, handsome, vain young man of about 28, who had been bred from the cradle to expect that he should one day be master of a great estate, and the one thing that stood between the Frosts and the long unhurried swallowing of Marchmont was a quiet motherless girl who knew more of bells than of lawyers and had not a friend in the world to act for her. What they did the way clever cold people do, with patience and paper and a perfect smooth surface. The late Earl's health failed all that autumn, and into the long anxious weeks of his illness the Dowager Countess gathered the whole management of the house and the sick room into her own hands. On the footing of a devoted wife nursing her lord, she made herself, by soft relentless degrees, the one person regularly admitted to his bedside, and managed that his daughter was kept, more and more, from the room where he lay, and she watched, and waited and laid her plans. For she had understood two things very quickly. She had understood that everything turned on whether Aurelia could be shown to be Trueborn, and that the proof of it, the entry of the Earl's quiet first marriage abroad copied and registered on his return into the register of the small old parish church, and the entry of Aurelia's own baptism in the same book, was a thing that could be reached. And she had understood that the Earl had let almost no one of any present weight know the particulars of that long-ago foreign marriage, so that if the right leaf could be made to vanish, and the right will burned, and the right story told, there would be no one of any consequence left to swear against her. And so, in the last weeks of the Earl's life, while the dying man lay watched and silenced behind a door his wife controlled, the thing was done. The old parson of the estate church, a frail and frightened man near the end of his own life, was prevailed upon, by what mixture of money and pressure and fear was never fully known, to give up the register into the dowager's keeping for safety, and the register, when it was next seen, had been got at. The leaf that carried the late Earl's marriage and Aurelia's baptism was gone, cut clean out at the binding. The new will the Earl had drafted but never proved, found among his papers, went into the fire, and a story was put about, gently, regretfully as a sad family duty, that there had been a sad irregularity in the late Earl's first connection, that the poor soft-hearted man, lonely after the foreign lady's death, had taken in and cherished the daughter of that connection out of a guilty conscience, calling her his ward and treating her, in his fond eccentric way, almost as a daughter, but that the girl had no true claim upon the name of Marchmont at all, being base-born, as the want of any record of a marriage would only too plainly show. They said it with sorrow in their voices, as a painful truth nobly faced. And the county, which had always thought the late Earl a queer reclusive man who let his motherless girl run wild among his moulds and his bells and never brought her properly out, found the story entirely easy to believe, and was rather touched by the proud family who had faced so awkward a truth so handsomely, and turned, almost overnight, from treating Aurelia as the daughter of the house to treating her as an embarrassment quietly tolerated, which was precisely what the dowager had paid for. The late Earl of Marchmont died on a black morning in December, and Aurelia, who was kept from his bedside at the very last by her stepmother's people and did not reach the door until the great tenor was already tolling, did not at first even understand what had been done to her. She knew only that her father was gone, and that she had been kept from him at the end, and that on the morning after the funeral she was called into the great cold library and informed, by a sharp dry man of business her stepmother had brought down from town, in a flat expressionless voice, of the terms on which she was now to live. The whole of the Earl's estate, the man explained, fell under the marriage settlement, and there being no true-born child of the Earl to take it, to the use of the Dowager Countess for her life, with the management wholly in her hands. And the late Earl's ward, Miss Sandys, they had given her her mother's maiden name, Sandys, as a kindness, that she might not embarrass the family by using a name to which she had no right, would be permitted, out of the Dowager's charity, to remain at Marchmont as a companion and a help about the house, with a small allowance and a room, so long as she made herself useful and gave no trouble. And when Aurelia rose, white and shaking, and said in a voice that would barely come that this was a lie, that her father had married her mother, that there was a register, that there had been a will, that the old parson would know, her stepmother turned from the tall window where she stood in her handsome black, and looked at her with a sorrow so beautifully done that 2 of the servants believed it, and said, gently, that they had all feared the poor girl would take it hard, that it was natural she should have built up fancies of belonging, having been so kindly used, but that she must be sensible now, and grateful, and not distress everyone by laying claim to things that were not, and had never been, hers. And the sharp man gathered his papers, and Mr. Julian Frost lounged in the great chair and looked bored. And that was the moment, though Aurelia did not yet know it, when the trap closed. It is the cruelest thing in this whole story, I think, and I want you to sit with it a moment before we go on, because everything that follows turns on it. They did not merely take her house. They took the very fact of who she was. A woman robbed of her fortune may cry out that it was hers and be heard. But they had arranged the world so that if Aurelia cried out that she was her father's true-born daughter, the cry itself would only prove how sadly the poor base-born creature had been let to imagine herself an earl's child, and her stepmother would shake her head over the pity of it and have her gently led away. They had not built her a prison of bars. They had built her a prison of her own erased name and the want of a single page of paper. And there is no wall in the world harder to break than the absence of a thing that ought to exist. And this is why I want you to stay with me, and to stay with Aurelia through the long middle of this story where it seems as though nothing can be done, because a prison built of a burned page can be broken, but only by the one thing the builders never reckon on, which is that a careful man who loves the truth will sometimes set a second copy of it where no thief would ever think to look. And Aurelia's father had set the truth very well indeed, in metal, in the dark, above the heads of all the liars in the county. And so within a year the cherished daughter of Marchmont found that she had become, by slow degrees and without any single moment she could point to, a dependent in her own former home, then a poor relation, and at last very nearly a servant. The good old servants who had known her from a child were turned off one by one, and replaced with the dowager's people, who had been told that Miss Sandys labored under sad delusions of grandeur, and were not to attend to anything she said. The fine rooms of the house were closed to her, and she was moved up, by quiet stages, to a cold small room over the dairy, and Aurelia was given to understand, kindly, that since she was so unaccountably clever about the late Earl's bells, and since it would be a great pity for the famous Marchmont ring to fall out of tune, and a great expense to bring a bell-founder down from London, she should earn her bread by keeping the bells of the estate herself, going up to the tower to see to their hanging and their ropes and their tuning, and to ring the small old hand-bell that set the sexton's hours, for which service she received her cold room and her board below the family and the privilege of being grateful. The poor base-born ward who had become the estate's bell-keeper, that was what she was made, and the county thought it a charming and a touching arrangement, and admired the family for their kindness to her, and never once wondered why a girl who had no head for anything fit could be trusted to keep the most perfectly tuned ring of bells in the kingdom in order. She bore it. She bore it because there seemed nothing else to do, and because grief had hollowed her out, and because some part of her, the part that had been a happy loved child at her father's bench, could not quite believe that the world she had been promised was safe had turned on her so completely. She bore it with a straight back and a still face and a great growing silence inside her. And she bore it, in the end, for one reason above all the others, which was the bells, and the great tenor most of all. For they had given her, thinking it a small humiliation, the one duty in all of Marchmont she would have asked for if they had let her ask. They had handed the silent keeping of her father's bells, the work of his hands and hers, into her own care, and shut the door on her, and called it a servant's task. And on the quiet evenings, when the house was at its dinner, Aurelia climbed the worn stone stair of the old tower with her father's tuning hammer in her apron pocket, and looked to the great bells he had founded, and stood among them in the cold high dark, and felt for a few minutes near to him again. And the bells, which did not read registers, and did not listen to gossip, and did not care whose name was on the deed, hung true and ready under her hands as they had always hung, so that the famous ring of Marchmont kept its perfect accord under the care of the young woman they said was nobody. And here I must tell you the thing that turns this story from a sorrow into a reckoning, and I will not keep you waiting for it the way some stories keep you waiting, because you have stayed with me this far and you have earned it. The famous ring had become under the new rule of Marchmont a thing to be shown off, and very soon a thing very nearly to be sold. For the Dowager Countess and her son had got the estate, but they had not got, with it, the one thing that keeps a great property above water, which is the sense not to spend, and within 2 years of the old Earl's death Mr. Julian Frost was deep in fashionable debt, with his racing and his card tables and his town lodgings, and his mother the dowager with him, and the great house began quietly to be stripped of its movable wealth to feed their creditors and their habits. The pictures went first, away to London out of the long gallery. The old plate went after. And then Mr. Frost, who had grown vain of the one truly famous thing the estate had come to be known for, fixed upon a notion that was to be the seed of his undoing. For he found that men of fashion and men of learning alike spoke of the great Marchmont ring as one of the marvels of the age, and that great antiquaries and collectors of curiosities would give a very long price indeed to own such a thing, or even to have a famous bell from such a ring for a chapel or a great new house, and he began to dream of the celebrity and the money that the famous bells and the famous name might bring him. But here was the difficulty, and here too was the seed of his ruin. Mr. Julian Frost knew nothing whatever about bells, and cared less, and his mother knew nothing either. And a great antiquary or a serious collector does not admire a marvel of founding on the word of an idle young man who cannot tell him the first thing about how it was made, but wants to hear it discoursed upon by one who understands it and can stand behind it. And so Mr. Frost did the thing that was to undo him in the end, the thing that clever idle people so often do, which was to take the knowledge he lacked from the one person he had helped to rob of everything else. For he made it understood, about the county and among the antiquaries who came, that the famous ring was in his own keeping and under his own improving care, that he had come into not merely the late Earl's bells but a good measure of the late Earl's understanding of them, and that he, Mr. Frost, was the man to speak to of them. He had a bright new tablet of bronze cast and bolted into the wall of the tower, beneath the old founder's marks, and the new tablet read that the famous ring of Marchmont had been restored and improved under the care of Mr. Julian Frost, and he learned by heart a few fine phrases about the founding of bells and the art of the change, and stood beneath the tower in a beautiful coat receiving the admiration of his visitors. And let it be thought that the marvel was half his own, while Aurelia, the true founder, who had cast and tuned the bells with her father and alone of any soul living knew how they went, stood silent at the back in her grey gown, brought up to be on hand should a rope want adjusting before company, and watched a roomful of strangers praise her step-brother's understanding over the work of her own hands, and said nothing, because to speak was to invite the kind sorrowful look and the gentle leading away, and because there was no one in the world who would have believed the base-born bell-keeper over the charming young master of the house. For 3 years she lived so, standing silent at the back of her own churchyard while the work of her years and her father's was praised under another's name, climbing the tower by night to keep in true the bells that were shown by day as another man's marvel, called nobody's daughter in the place where she had been everybody's darling. And she told no one. And she cried out to no one, not because she had given up, but because she had learned the shape of her prison and knew there was no use beating on those particular walls, and she did the one thing they could not stop her doing, which was to keep faith with her father's bells and his memory and the truth. And to wait. For her father, at the very last, in the few stolen moments her stepmother's vigilance had not quite managed to deny them, had given her two strange charges that she had not understood at the time, and that she had turned over in her mind 1,000 times in the long cold nights since, and though she did not yet know what they meant, she had kept them. The way you keep the last words of someone you loved, against the day they would come clear. The first charge her father had given her, in one of the last clear hours of his life, when his wife had been called from the room and they were, for a few minutes, alone, had been about the great tenor bell. He had taken her hand, and he had been very weak, but his eyes had been clear and urgent, clearer than they had been in days, and he had told her that whatever happened, whatever was said, whatever anyone told her she was never, on any account, to let the great tenor bell be sold or carried away from the Tower of Marchmont, nor melted, nor recast, that she was to keep it, and tend it, and stay near it, and above all that whatever befell, she must see that the great tenor was never destroyed. For the tenor, he said with the ghost of his old smile, has more to say than its note. She had thought then that it was only a dying founder's love for the chief glory of his life's work, and a father's wish that his daughter keep the one great thing they had made together. And she had promised, and she had kept the promise fiercely through everything, refusing with a mute stubbornness that the household took for one of her sad fancies to let that one bell go however high the offer, until even Mr. Frost, who would have sold the whole ring twice over, had given up the tenor as more trouble than it was worth, the great cracked dumb thing, and let it hang silent in the dark of the tower exactly where the dying man had meant it to hang, waiting, for the great tenor of Marchmont had cracked. You must understand, at the very last office it had done its master, it had tolled for the old Earl's funeral, the deep slow strokes rolling out over the frozen park as they bore him to the family vault. And on one of those strokes, in the bitter cold of that December, the great bell had split its sound with a flat broken note that those who knew bells had heard with a shiver, and after that day it had never been rung again, but hung silent and sound cracked on its great oaken stock above the other 7, dumb and, the family thought, fit only one day to be sold for its weight of bronze or sent away to be recast. And that too was a part of the cruel chance of Aurelia's 3 years. For a cracked bell that hangs dumb and unmoved is a bell no one troubles to bring down, and a bell that is never brought down is never turned over, and a bell that is never turned over keeps whatever is cast inside it hidden in the dark of its own mouth forever. The great tenor hung mouth down in the tower as all hung bells hang, its deep crown to the sky and its wide mouth to the floor, and the inside of it, the dark vault of its inner crown that no one standing in the ringing chamber below could ever see, faced only the timbers and the heavens, and there the late Earl had cast his daughter's truth, where it would face only heaven until the day the bell was brought down and turned. And the second charge her father had given her was stranger still, and she had understood it even less. He had told her in that same last clear hour that there would come a day, he could not say when the great tenor would be taken down from the tower, that the day would come, whatever she did to put it off. For a cracked bell cannot hang dumb forever and must one day be lowered, to be sold or melted or mended, and that when that day came, whoever brought the bell down, she was to see, by any means she could contrive, that the great tenor was turned mouth up to the daylight and looked into before any soul let it be carried off, and that she herself was to be there, and to look beneath the founder's plate. He had said it just so, see it turned over, and look beneath the plate, and she would understand a thing he could not tell her now with other ears so near the door. She had wept, and thought his mind was wandering at the last into the gentle nonsense of a dying man, and had promised that too. And in all the 3 hard years since, she had kept the great tenor from being sold, and had waited, not knowing for what, and she had begun, in her lowest moments, to fear that he had meant nothing after all. She did not yet know that her father had been a founder of bells to the very marrow of him, and had used, for his last message to her, the same patient cleverness he had used all his life upon his metal, nor that the day he had foretold, the day the great tenor must come down, was now very near at hand, brought on by the very greed of the people who had robbed her, nor that there would be, when it came, the right eyes in the churchyard to see what the bell had to show. Before that day comes, though, while Aurelia keeps her silent watch in the cold tower and the whole cruel design of her life is laid out plain before you, let me ask one thing of you, because the next part of her story is the part where everything begins at last to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Aurelia's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. That is the only time I will ask. Now come back to the churchyard, because the carriage is at the light gate. The Marquess of Stoneleigh was a name the county knew and did not love. Gabriel Severn, the young Marquess, was a man of about 35, grave, exacting, and very rich, the master of a great estate 2 days' journey to the north, and he had a reputation among the fashionable people who had tried and failed to charm him, for being cold. He did not dance attendance on hostesses, he did not flatter, he did not suffer a fool or a fraud for the sake of being agreeable, and he had a way of looking at a thing, or a person, with a long level gray-eyed attention that took its true measure, and was not to be put off by surface, which made shallow people uncomfortable and dishonest people afraid. They called him cold for it. In truth he was not cold but exact, a serious private man who cared for very few things and cared for those few with his whole considerable heart, and the chief of them, the one passion of his guarded life, was the study he had loved since he was a boy, which was the antiquities of his country, and above all, the old and noble craft of the bell. He was, though the fashionable world did not trouble to understand it, one of the first antiquaries and campanologists of the kingdom, who knew the marks of every great founder of 2 centuries, and had himself learned to ring and to tune for love and for knowledge, and he had, as a young man, deeply revered the late Earl of Marchmont, with whom he had once exchanged letters on the tuning of the partial tones of a great bell, and had grieved at his death, and had wondered, more than once in the years since, what had become of the famous Marchmont ring and of the daughter the old Earl had once mentioned, in a letter Severn still kept, with a pride so peculiar and so warm that it had stayed in the younger man's memory all these years. What had brought him to Marchmont, on that cold bright morning at the end of January, was the bells. Word had reached him, as it reached every serious man in the kingdom, that the wonders of Marchmont were coming, one by one, onto the market, and that the family might be brought to part even with the great ring, or at the least with the famous tenor, for a long enough price. And the Marquess of Stoneleigh, who had heard all his life of the unmatched Marchmont ring that spoke in a truer accord than any in England, had written and been answered, and had come himself, as he did all things of importance, to hear and judge before he bought. He did not, of course, know the half of what he was walking into. He knew only that he was to be received by the new master, Mr. Julian Frost, who was said to keep the late Earl's bells and understand them, and he had come prepared to find at least a serious custodian who could talk of the great ring with understanding, and to buy, if it was all it was said to be, the finest bells in England. He was met at the light gate by Mr. K. Julian Frost in a coat of the latest cut with a great deal of fobs and seals, and by the proud Dowager Countess all stately civility, and was made much of and given wine, and led at last up into the cold ringing chamber of the squat old tower where the famous ropes hung down in their colored sallies, and it was there, within the first quarter of an hour, that the whole careful fraud of 3 years began, very quietly to come apart, for the simple reason that the Marquess of Stoneleigh knew exactly what he was looking at, and listening to, and Mr. Julian Frost did not. For Severn, looking up at the great bells in the gloom above and asking that a few be chimed for him, was as near to happy as he ever came, in the presence of a true thing truly made, and he did what such a man cannot help doing, which was to ask questions. Real questions, a master's questions, about how the ring had been brought into such accord, how the great tenor had been tuned in its partial tones, what alloy the late Earl had favored, what the founder had done about the old fault that besets all such heavy bells, and Mr. Julian Frost, who had learned by heart a dozen fine phrases and not one true thing, floundered. He smiled and waved his beautiful hand, and said that the secret was all in the genius of the late Earl, his stepfather, and that he himself kept the bells regulated to a nicety, and that these were deep matters not easily explained to a layman. And Severn, listening with that long level attention, his face growing graver by the minute, understood within 10 minutes, with the certainty of one master measuring another, that the charming young man beside him did not know the first thing about the bells he claimed to keep, could not answer the simplest true question about them, did not so much as know a tenor from a treble nor a founder's mark from a date, and was in plain fact a fraud. And then Mr. Frost, eager to show off the one effect he was sure of, bade the 2 ringers he had hired chime the great ring through a few rounds, and the bells spoke, and it was beautiful. The deep true chord of the 8, what there was of it, rolling out over the churchyard. And Severn stood and listened with the pleasure of a man hearing a thing done nearly right, and then with a small frown, for his ear, which missed nothing, had caught at once that the great voice of the ring, the deep tenor that should have been the ground of all, was not there. That the 8 he heard were truly but 7 and a stop place where the foundation should be. And when the chiming was done he turned to Mr. Frost and asked the one question that mattered, which was why the great tenor of Marchmont, the famous bell above all the others, was silent. And Mr. Julian Frost, out of his depth and rattled, said something so completely and ignorantly wrong about why it did not ring, claiming it some matter of the late Earl's whim and a nicety of tuning kept for great occasions, that it was as though a man had claimed to have written a great book and then could not say what was in its last and greatest chapter. For the truth, which any true ringer knew, and which Severn smoked in an instant from the flat ghost in the air, was that the great tenor was cracked and dumb, and had been these 3 years, and the master of the house did not even know enough of his own famous bells to give an honest account of why the chief of them had no voice. And the Marquess of Stoneleigh went silent, and cold, and very still, and said nothing at all, because he had just understood, past any doubt, that this preening young master had no more founded or tuned or kept that great ring than he had hung the stars, and that somewhere, someone else had. And it was in that silence, looking about him for the truth that had to be there, that the Marquess of Stoneleigh first truly saw Aurelia. She had been there the whole while, of course, where she always was when company came to the bells, standing quiet at the back of the ringing chamber in her plain grey gown, a shabby unregarded figure he had taken, when he noticed her at all, for some upper servant of the house. But he was not, whatever the county said, an ordinary man, and he had learned to read fine work, and the hands and the ears that make it, and watching now, with all his attention woken and suspicious, he saw what no one at Marchmont had troubled in 3 years to see. He saw how she stood, the straight back, the still composure, the lifted head that did not belong to a servant. He saw her hands, which, plain and work-worn as they were, had about them the particular sureness of hands that know fine metal and fine tuning from the inside. And he saw, above all, when he had asked why the great tenor was silent and Mr. Frost had blundered, that the silent woman at the back had gone very still, and that at the flat ghost of the cracked bell in the air her own head had turned, just barely toward the dark where the great tenor hung, with the unconscious wince of one who knows exactly what is wrong with a thing and grieves it, and then her grey eyes had lifted, and for one unguarded instant had met his across the dim chamber with a flash of such fierce, sorrowful, intelligent understanding, the look of one who knows a thing meeting another who knows it, that it went through him like cold water, and he knew in that instant, beyond his power to explain it, that he was looking at the person who had founded those bells. He said nothing then. He was far too careful a man to show his hand in a house he did not trust, before people he had decided within the hour were liars. He concluded his visit with a cold courtesy, said that the ring was indeed remarkable and that he would consider his offer and right, and let himself be bowed out by the smiling Mr. Frost and the stately dowager to his carriage. But he did not drive away. He had his man pull up beyond the lich gate, out of sight of the tower, and he sat a long while, frowning, turning it over, for the Marquess of Stoneleigh could not abide an unsolved thing or a dishonest one, and here was both. And then he did a thing that was very unlike his cold reputation and entirely like his exact and honest heart. He resolved to find out the truth. He had heard, in the talk over the wine, the family's sad handsome story of the late Earl's base-born ward who was so oddly clever about the bells and kept the tower. And he had seen, at the back of the ringing chamber, a silent woman with the bearing of a gentlewoman and the hands and the ear of a master, and the two pictures would not lie down together in his mind, and he meant to know why. Here is the place, I think, where you should understand the man a little better, because the county had him wrong, and so at first did Aurelia, and a great deal of what is coming turns on his being understood. The world called the Marquess of Stoneleigh cold, and pointed to his silences and his refusals and his terrible exactness as proof of it, and the world, as it so often is, was exactly wrong, for it had mistaken the manner for the man. He was not a man who felt little. He was a man who felt much, and early in his life had been taught, by some private grief the world never learned the whole of, that a careless heart and a careless tongue do harm, and had resolved to be careful, and to be true, and never to say a thing he did not mean nor praise a thing that did not deserve it, and a man who will not lie, in a world that runs on small lies, is always called cold by the people whose small lies he will not tell. He had loved exactly two things wholly in his life, the memory of a good mother long dead, and the pure pursuit of his study, and into that study he had poured all the warmth that a colder man would have spent on flattery, and it had made him, by 35, the most honest man and one of the loneliest in the kingdom. And this is the thing the dowager, with all her cold cleverness, had failed entirely to reckon on when she let into her tower a man whose whole nature was an instrument for telling the true from the false. She had built a fraud of perfect smooth surface, calculated for a world of people who do not look closely, and had admitted to it the one man in the county who looked closely at everything, and listened closer still. And here, before we go on, is the second thing you should understand, the thing the whole long middle of the story turns on, and it is this: that the small daily cruelties Aurelia had borne for 3 years were not, as they seemed, a string of separate slights, the natural unkindness of proud people to a poor dependent, but one single deliberate design, thought out from the first and held to without a flaw. The dowager had not merely failed to be kind to her stepdaughter. She had set out, coldly and with her eyes open, to steal an estate, and had understood from the beginning that to do it she must do more than reach a register and burn a will and tell a lie. She must make the lie unbreakable. And the way to make a lie unbreakable is to arrange that the truth, when it is told, will sound like the very thing the lie has prepared the world to expect. She had not slandered Aurelia's birth and then, separately, made her a servant. She had made her a servant because a servant claiming to be an earl's daughter is pitiable and absurd. And pity and absurdity are the strongest locks there are. And she had encouraged the talk that the girl was strange and clever about the bells, because the more her one real gift was made to seem a harmless eccentricity, the less anyone would ever ask the dangerous question of where a base-born ward had learned to found and tune the finest ring of bells in the kingdom. Every humiliation had a purpose, and the purpose was always the same, to make Aurelia's truth unsayable. And against that one cold flawless design there now stood, all unknowing, two people. A wronged woman who had kept faith with the truth in silence for 3 years, and a cold proud man who could not rest while a lie stood unbroken in front of him. And the design, built to withstand a world of people who do not look, had no defense at all against two who do. The Marquess of Stoneleigh went home to the north, and to all appearances did nothing. He wrote a cool civil letter saying that he was considering his offer for the bells, which kept his foot in the door and his name welcome at Marchmont. But behind the cool letter he set quietly to work, and put his man of business to it, a steady, discreet, weathered man named Mr. Hollis, who had served him 20 years and asked no questions beyond the ones his master wanted answered. The Marquess wanted answered, first of all, the simplest and most damning question there is, which is where the people went, for he had learned, in a long life of looking closely, that when a great wrong is done quietly in a great house, there are always servants turned off who knew too much, and a lawyer suddenly dispensed with, and a witness or two gone conveniently away, and that these scattered inconvenient people, gathered up and gently asked, will between them tell you everything the smooth surface was built to hide. And so Mr. Hollis went down into the county, not to Marchmont but to the villages and towns round about it, and began, without any noise, to find the people the Dowager had thought safely scattered, the old servants turned off after the Earl's death, the family solicitor so suddenly dismissed, and above all, anyone still living who had known the truth of the late Earl's marriage. He found, first, the old solicitor. Mr. Bramwell had been the late Earl of Marchmont's careful country man of law for 30 years, a gray-haired, honest, precise old gentleman who had drawn the Earl's affairs and known his mind, and he had been turned from the door within a month of the Earl's death and had retired, hurt and unconsulted, to a small house in the cathedral town nearby. And when the Marquess of Stoneleigh's discreet man of business came and asked, carefully, what he knew of the family, the old man, who had carried his suspicions in silence for 3 years because no one of any weight had ever asked him, and a lone country lawyer cannot move against a great family on suspicion alone, opened his heart at last. He had never, he said, believed the sad story of the base-born ward, for the late Earl had spoken of his daughter always and only as his true-born child and heir, and had told him plainly, years before, of the marriage abroad and of its due registering on his return into the parish book, which Mr. Bramwell had himself seen entered in the old parson's own hand. More than that, in the Earl's last year he had come privately to Mr. Bramwell, troubled and urgent, and instructed him to draw a new will that should provide his daughter outright and beyond the reach of the old settlement, and had spoken, with a strange grim quietness, of his fear that his wife's people would attempt something against the girl if he died before all was made fast, and then the Earl had sickened faster than any had looked for, and Mr. Bramwell had been shut out of the sick-room and turned from the door at the death, and the new will, which he believed the Earl had executed in some rough form before the end, had never come into his hands and was nowhere to be found. He had the firmest belief that there had been foul work with both register and will. But belief was not proof. The leaf was gone. The will was gone. The old parson was dead, and an old solicitor's word that he had once seen an entry that no longer existed, and believed in a will he had never held, would weigh as nothing against a family in possession, and a register that showed a blank. He could not put the vanished page back into the world, and without the page, or the will, or some proof as good as either, the truth would die with the few old people who remembered it, exactly as the Dowager Countess of Marchmont had designed that it should. The Marquess of Stoneleigh, when his man brought him all this, felt the case settle in his mind into a shape at once clearer and harder. He believed now, on the old lawyer's word and the evidence of his own eyes and ears in the tower, that the silent bell-keeper of Marchmont was the late Earl's true-born daughter, robbed of her name and her birthright by a cold, clever woman and a burned page, and a burned will, and the believing of it moved him, this exact and guarded man, more than he would have thought any wrong done to a stranger could move him, for he had revered her father, and could not bear that a true thing should be unmade by a lie, and there was, though he did not yet name it so even to himself, something in the memory of that one fierce, sorrowful, intelligent look that had lodged in him, and would not be dislodged. But believing was not proving, and the proving looked very near impossible. The page was burned. The will was burned. The parson dead. the law on the side of possession. And it was at this point, casting about for any thread that might serve, that the Marquess remembered two things at once: the late Earl's letter, years old, that he still kept, speaking of his daughter with that peculiar warm pride, and a single odd phrase in it that he had never understood, and that now, with all he had learned, came back to him and would not leave him be. For the late Earl of Marchmont, in that old letter on the tuning of the partial tones of a great bell, had written, near the end, a sentence that had seemed at the time only the fond flourish of a bell-mad father, and that the Marquess of Stoneleigh, reading it again now by his own fireside, read with a slow rising attention. "My daughter," the late Earl had written, "has helped me to bells that keep better faith than men do, and I have lately been at work upon a labor you would understand, the casting of a great bell that shall carry, in the dark of its own crown where it faces only heaven, words I would set beyond the reach of any liar's hand, to be read on the day it is brought down and turned to the light, by the one who knows to look beneath its founder's plate." The Marquess set the letter down, and sat very still and felt the cold, clever, electric certainty of a man who sees, all at once, the shape of an answer. The old Earl had hidden something in a bell. He had said as much, years ago, in a letter he could not have dreamed would ever be read against this need. He had cast into the crown of some great bell words set where they could not be reached or read until it was brought down and turned over, and bidden whoever knew look beneath its founder's plate. The proof that was not in the register, the proof the Dowager had been so sure she had destroyed, the careful founding man had made a second time, in the one form she would never think to search, and could not have read if she had. He had cast it into the body and hidden it under the plate of his own great bell, in the dark of the tower facing heaven, above all their heads. The Marquess of Stoneleigh did not, being the man he was, go off half-cocked on a guess, however brilliant. He sent his man of business back into the county to find the last and most important of the scattered people, the one who, if any single soul still living knew the secret of the bells, would be the one to know it, the late Earl's old workman. For the great Marchmont ring had not been wholly the work of the Earl and his daughter alone. In the heavy labor of it, the digging of the casting pit and the raising and hanging of the bells, they had been helped for years by a faithful old bell hanger and founder's man of the estate, a man named Ezra Pike, who had worked at the late Earl's pit since the Earl himself was young, and had been turned off with the rest after the death. Mr. Hollis found him at last, old Ezra Pike, near 70 now and poor, living with a married niece a day's ride from Marchmont, his hands stiff but his memory clear. And when the Marquess himself, who would trust so weighty a thing to no one else, came quietly to see him, and told him plainly who he was and what he believed and meant to do, the old man wept. And then he talked, for the first time in 3 years, of the thing he had carried alone. He had been there, old Pike said, at the very end. In the last year of the master's life, when he had cast the great new tenor to crown the ring, the master had done a strange and secret thing in the founding of it that old Pike had helped with and sworn to keep close. When the great tenor was molded, the master had it built into the thick crown of the bell where the metal was deepest a small chamber, faced after the casting with a stout plate of brass let in flush and bolted down over it, so that the plate seemed only a founder's tablet such as great bells often carry, and beneath that plate, wrapped close in oiled silk against the damp of the tower, the master had laid a sealed packet of papers. And more than that, and cleverer than that, old Pike said, the thing only such a founder could have done, the master had cut his molding so that into the inner crown of the great bell, the dark vault of the inside that faces up into the tower, and that no soul standing below can ever see, there should be cast, raised proud in the bronze itself, a legend in the master's own words, words that would hang in the dark above the heads of all the world for as long as the bell hung mouth down, and that could be read by living eyes only on the day it was brought down and turned mouth up to the daylight. And what the master had cast there, and sealed beneath the plate, was his daughter's truth that she was his true-born child, born in lawful wedlock, the heir of his body, and the proofs of it, For the master had said to him, standing by the cooling bell in the dark of the foundry, that a bell speaks the truth to a whole county at once and cannot be made to lie. That if his enemies should ever burn the paper truth of his daughter's birth, they should never think to look for it cast in metal in the dark crown of a bell hung 60 feet above their heads, facing only heaven, and that there it should wait safe in the bronze, until the one day the bell came down and was turned, when it should speak, and could not be denied. And now at last you understand, as Aurelia herself did not yet understand, why the great tenor had hung silent and unmoved all the 3 years and never given up its secret. For a bell that hangs cannot be read, and her father had known that too, and had been, even in this, the patient careful maker to the last. He had foreseen that the day would come, must come, when the great tenor would be brought down. A cracked bell cannot hang dumb forever, but must one day be lowered to be melted and recast or mended, and on that day whoever brought it down, the bell must be turned mouth up to be handled, and its inner crown turned at last to the light, and its founder's plate laid bare to any who thought to lift it. The master had built his whole secret upon that certainty, that bronze is patient, and that a bell sooner or later always comes down. He had only charged his daughter, and old Pike too, to see by any means that when the day came the bell was looked into before it was carried off, and that the one who knew should be there to read it and lift the plate. And the day old Pike said, his old eyes bright and frightened at once, must surely be near now, for he had heard even in his poor retirement that the new master of Marchmont was deep in debt and minded to sell the famous bells, and a buyer who took the great cracked tenor would have it down from the tower within the week, and turned over on the green to be looked at and weighed, and on that day, if the right eyes were there, the great bell would do, before whatever company stood in the churchyard, the thing it had waited 3 years in the dark to do. The Marquess of Stoneleigh rode back to the north with the whole shape of it clear in his mind and a cold bright purpose in his heart. He knew now what the great tenor held and how it would give it up. He knew the chance was at hand, for he himself was the very buyer who would bring the bell down, and had only to conclude his purchase and name his day, and he understood, with the pleasure of a man who loves a thing done exactly right, that the trap the dowager had built so cleverly was about to be sprung by the one means in the world she had no power over, the patient witness of an honest bell. But he understood, too, that it must be done rightly, and witnessed, and made proof against every denial. For he knew his enemy now, and knew that a cold, clever woman with an estate to lose, faced with words cast in bronze and a packet under a plate, would not crumble but would fight, would cry forgery and the mad fancies of the base-born ward, unless it were done before so many eyes, and the right eyes that no denial could stand. And so the Marquess laid his own quiet plan. He wrote to Mr. Julian Frost a warm and flattering letter, saying that he was now very much disposed to buy the great ring, and the famous tenor above all, at the long price named, and that he would come again to Marchmont to conclude the matter and see the great tenor brought down with his own eyes before it left the county, and he named for the lowering a particular bright day a fortnight off, and arranged that the bringing down of so famous a bell should be a small occasion, with a few persons of weight invited to see it lowered and the bargain struck. Among them, though Marchmont did not know he had a hand in it, the old solicitor Mr. Bramwell, and an upright magistrate of the county whose honesty was known, and 1 or 2 others whose witness no one would dare to doubt. The dowager, scenting only money and consequence, was delighted, and set about preparing a handsome mourning, and so it was that she herself, with her own cold, clever hands, arranged to gather into the churchyard of Marchmont, on the very day the great bell was to be turned to the light, and all unknowing, the very audience before whom her 3 years' work was to be undone. I want to slow us down now. Here on the threshold of the day everything turns, because we have come a long way at Aurelia's side and through a great deal of patient cold cruelty. And the turning, when it comes, comes fast. So let us be in the churchyard of Marchmont on that bright cold morning, with the squat grey tower above and the frost still white in the shadow of its north wall, and the great occasion making ready. Mr. Julian Frost was there in his best coat, all smiles, certain only of the long price coming and the consequence of selling to so famous a man. The Dowager Countess of Marchmont was there in handsome dove gray, the very picture of a great lady honored. The few invited persons of the county stood about the green in their winter finery, waiting to see the famous bell come down, and a gang of stout men with ropes and a great timber gin, a sheer legs of heavy beams rigged over the tower door, had been got down from the nearest town to lower the bell. And at the back of the little crowd, where she always stood when the bells were shown, the silent woman in the gray gown stood unregarded, and she watched, with a still face and a heart she could not have named the state of, the men make ready to bring down the great tenor her father had charged her, above all things, to keep, and that she had kept for 3 years, and that was now to be lowered at last and sold away from her forever. She knew only that they were taking the last and dearest thing, her father's great bell, the one work of his she had left whole, and that she was to stand by and watch it go, and she remembered, with a dull old ache she had given up expecting anything of, that her father had charged her. When this day came, to see the bell turned over and to look beneath its plate, the Marquess of Stoneleigh arrived, grave and exact and courteous, and was received with great honor, and made his slow way through the little company toward the tower, exchanging cool civilities, his long gray eyes missing nothing, and as he came he marked, without seeming to, the silent woman at the back, whom he did not so much as glance at twice for fear of betraying her, and contrived by a word here and a grave question there, to draw the whole company in about the foot of the tower as the men set to their work, so that without quite knowing why they did it, Mr. Frost and the Dowager and all the invited county were gathered close about the tower door, their eyes upon the great gin and the slow descent, exactly as the Marquess of Stoneleigh wished them to be. For he had timed his coming and his arrangements to a nicety, and meant that when the bell came down there should be no carrying it off into a cart unseen, but that it should be lowered onto a stout timber cradle there on the green before them all, and turned mouth up, that he might, as the careful buyer of so famous a thing, examine its founding and its crack with his own knowledgeable eyes before the bargain was finally struck, and to that the whole company, knowing his fame and thinking it only the caution of a great connoisseur, had agreed without a thought. It is a slow and a heavy business, the lowering of a great bell, and I will not pretend it came down in a moment. The men sweated at the ropes and the great gin creaked, and by inches and careful stages the huge dark shape of the tenor came down out of the lurid gloom of the bell chamber, swinging slow and ponderous on its lines. 60 hundredweight of bronze that had hung silent since it told its master to the vault, and the little crowd in the churchyard fell silent too, with that hush that comes on people in the presence of a great old thing being moved, and watched it come down. And the silent woman at the back came forward a step, and then another, drawn by she knew not what, her eyes fixed on the great bell that was her father's last and best work, and the Marquess of Stoneleigh, watching her face and not the bell, saw the moment some old buried charge stirred in her, see it turned over, look beneath the plate and saw the slow widening of her gray eyes, and saw her lips part. And the great tenor of Marchmont came to rest at last, with a deep groan of its timbers. Low on the stout cradle the men had set for it, and the ropes were shifted, and the men heaved it over, slow and grunting, and turned the great bell mouth up to the open winter sky. And the bright cold daylight fell, for the first time in many years, into the dark vault of the great bell's inner crown. There was a moment in which no one understood, for the inside of a bell newly turned up is a strange dim hollow, and the eye takes a breath to read it, and then the Marquess of Stoneleigh, who had been waiting for exactly this and knew what to look for, stepped to the rim of the great bell and looked down into the bronze vault of the crown where the metal was thick and dark, and went very still. For there, cast raised and proud in the bronze itself, running in a great band around the inside of the crown where it had hung facing only heaven and the tower timbers for all the years the bell hung dumb, were words, fine clear founded letters, set there in the casting by the late Earl's own hand and his own molds, that no soul standing in the ringing chamber below could ever have seen. and that the cold winter sun now lit, for the first time since the day the metal cooled, plain for living eyes to read. And the Marquess raised his head, and his voice when it came was not loud, but it was the voice of a man no one in the churchyard would have dreamed of disobeying, and it carried clear across the frosted green. "Let no one touch this bell," he said, "until what is written in it has been read aloud before us all, for I think the great tenor of Marchmont has been kept waiting a long time to say this, and we should all of us do it the courtesy of listening." And he turned to the upright old magistrate at his side, and asked him, as the honest man of the county, to read aloud what the late Earl of Marchmont had cast inside his own great bell. The Dowager Countess of Marchmont, whose cold cleverness was quicker than them all, went, in one instant, the color of ash, for she alone understood at once that something had come out of the dark that was not in her reckoning, and she made one sharp movement, as if she would have come forward to the bell. But the Marquess of Stoneleigh was between her and it, and a word from him stayed her where she stood. And the old magistrate, mystified and grave, came to the great upturned bell, and bent over its rim, and read out into the dead silence of the churchyard, slowly, for the founded letters ran round and were strange to follow, the words that the late Earl of Marchmont had set there against this very hour. "I, the Earl of Marchmont," the magistrate read out, "of sound mind though failing body, have cast these words in the crown of this my last and greatest bell, where no lyre may reach them, to be read on the day it is brought down and turned to the light. Aurelia is my trueborn and only child, born in lawful wedlock of my first and lawful wife, and the heir of my body in blood and in law. And what wicked hands may try to take from her, I have set here beyond their taking. Let her, and all who hear this read, look beneath the founder's plate of this bell, where the proofs of it lie sealed. A bell speaks the truth to a whole county at once, and cannot be made to lie, and this one I have taught to speak my daughter's name when she has need. So wrote her father, the magistrate read, the late Earl of Marchmont, and there followed his name, founded in the bronze, and the date of the casting, 3 years and more before. I have tried, in the telling of many people's troubles, to find words for the moment when a long injustice breaks, and I have never quite found them. And I will not pretend to find them now. But I will ask you to look. In that frozen churchyard, not at the ashen face of the dowager nor at the gaping ruin of Mr. Julian Frost's smile, but at the silent woman in the gray gown who had come forward to the great bell, who had been called nobody's daughter for 3 years, and who heard, read aloud by an honest man before the whole county out of the bronze her father had founded, in her father's own cast words, that she was his true-born child, and his only one, and the heir of his body, and who heard her father's voice reach across 3 years and the grave to keep the charge he had given her with his last clear breath, and to give her back, out of the dark crown of his own great bell, the name they had stolen. She did not cry out. She had not cried out in 3 years, and she did not begin now. She put one hand to the cold bronze rim of the great bell, and stood very straight, and the tears ran down her still face without a sound, and into the silence she said, in a low clear voice that carried across the hushed green, the first words she had spoken before that company in 3 years. "I told them," she said. "I told them there was a register and a will. They said I was dreaming." And the whole churchyard turned, as one, to look at the woman they had all been told was nobody, and saw her for the first time, plain. What followed, the law and the proving of it, took longer than a single bright morning, but it could only end one way now, for the dying founder had built his case as truly as he founded his bells, and had left nothing to chance. The Marquess of Stoneleigh, before them all, had the great brass founder's plate that was bolted in the crown of the bell taken off, and old Ezra Pike, brought up quietly from the back of the crowd where the Marquess had had him wait, his old hands shaking, showed where the chamber had been cut and the plate let in and bolted down, and the plate was lifted. And out of the little chamber beneath it came the sealed packet wrapped close in oiled silk, dry and perfect after its years in the dark of the bronze, and in it, exactly as the cast legend had promised, lay the late Earl of Marchmont's true marriage lines, drawn and witnessed, and the very leaf of the parish register, cut out and carried off and thought destroyed. That the careful old parson, frightened and pressed but not wholly corrupt, had at the last given secretly to the Earl rather than burned, so that the Earl might hide the truth where his enemies could not reach it, the leaf that carried, in the old parson's own hand, the entry of the late Earl's lawful marriage and the baptism of Aurelia, his true-born daughter. And with these lay the late Earl's own sworn and witnessed will and confession, written in his last illness and witnessed by old Pike and one other, setting out the whole of it, his marriage, his daughter's true birth, his provision of her as the heir of his body, and his charge to whoever should one day open the bell to see his daughter righted. There was no answer to it. The register leaf was in the dead parson's own undoubted hand and fitted the cut binding in the stolen book exactly. The will and confession were the late Earl's own. Against the patient witness of the bell and the proofs it had kept, the burned page, and the burned will, and the smooth 3 years' lie simply fell to nothing. The Dowager Countess of Marchmont fought of course to the cold bitter last, as the Marquess of Stoneleigh had known she would. She cried contrivance and forgery, and the malice of a stranger lord and a mad servant, with all the icy composure of her proud nature. But she was fighting now not a silent friendless girl but the plain proofs of a dead man, read out before an honest magistrate and the witness of the county and stood behind by one of the first men in the kingdom. And the more she fought the worse it showed, for the magistrate had only to send for the stolen register book itself, kept all this while among the late Earl's seized things, and lay the recovered leaf against the tell-tale cut, and the thing was past all denying. The law moved. Slowly and surely, the suppression of the register and the burning of the will were laid bare, and the part the dowager's steward had played, and he, to save himself, told the rest. Within the year the false claim of base birth was overturned in form and in law. Aurelia was declared, before the world that had called her nobody, the late Earl of Marchmont's trueborn and only child and the heir of his body, and the great estate and the whole fortune that went with it. 3 years in the wrong hands were restored to her, the old settlement cut down at last by the proving of her father's true will to the modest provision he had always meant his widow to have. Mr. Julian Frost was master no longer, but plain Mr. Frost, again exposed and ridiculed before the very fashionable world whose admiration he had bought with another's genius, shone before everyone unable to give an honest account of the very bells he had bolted his name to, and he left the county under a cloud of debt and mockery and was not much heard of after. And the dowager, the cold clever architect of it all, escaped the worst of the law only by the mercy of the woman she had wronged, who would not in the end hound even her stepmother to a prison cell, but she was stripped of the place and the consequence she had committed every cruelty to seize, reduced to the modest jointure that was lawfully hers and not a penny more, and put out of Marchmont to a narrow genteel poverty with her ruined son, which for a woman of her pride was a harder punishment than any the law could have set, and she went, and the great house was rid of her. But I have got ahead of the part you have stayed for, which is not the law nor the ruin of the wicked, but the woman herself, and the cold proud man, and what grew between them out of that broken morning in the churchyard. For the Marquess of Stoneleigh had come to Marchmont to buy a ring of bells, and had stayed to break a lie and right a wrong, and somewhere in the long careful weeks of the doing of it, this exact and guarded man, who had loved wholly only 2 things in all his life, had come, almost against his own will and quite against his cold reputation, to love a third. He had not fallen for a face across a ballroom which was not in his nature. He had fallen, slowly and surely and for keeps, for a mind and a spirit, for the founder of bells he had revered before he ever knew her name, for the straight-backed silent woman who had kept faith with the truth in a servant's apron for 3 years and never once groveled, for the fierce sorrowful intelligence of that first look across the chamber, and the low clear dignity of I told them there was a register, and the sure knowing hands and the truer ear that read a great bell as his own did. He had found in the wronged daughter of Marchmont the one thing his lonely exact heart had never thought to find in all the fashionable world, which was an equal, another creature who loved the truth of a made thing above its show, set down as he had always felt himself to be. Alone in a world that loved only the show. And it had undone him, quietly and completely. And being an honest man, he did not pretend otherwise to himself. But he was too honest a man, and too careful to press his own heart upon her in the hour of her vindication. When she was newly given back her name and her house and stood in the full strange daylight of being herself again after 3 years in the dark, for he knew that a woman just freed from one person's power is owed, before all things, the room to be no one's but her own. And so the Marquess of Stoneleigh did a thing that earned him more, in the end, than any wooing could have done. He stood back. He saw her righted, and stood by her through the law and asked nothing, and when it was done, and Marchmont was hers, and the false family gone, he made ready to take his cold courteous leave, having, as he believed, no right to press a claim. And it was Aurelia, in the end, who stayed him. Aurelia, standing in the churchyard that was hers again, beneath the tower of her father's bells, who looked at the grave, lonely, honest man who had asked her for nothing and given her everything, and understood him, as the county never had, exactly, and who said to him, quietly, that she had been 3 years unable to speak the truth, and meant never to be silent about a true thing again, and that the truth was that she did not want him to go. But, she said, and here she smiled, the first true smile seen on her face in 3 years. She had also been 3 years a thing other people moved and disposed of without her asking, and she would not, even for the best man she had ever known, be quickly disposed of again, however kindly she would have. First, a year to be the Earl of Marchmont's daughter in her own house, in her own right, answering to no one, a year to climb her father's tower as its mistress and not its servant, and bring the great cracked tenor true again with her own hands, a year to be, at last and for the first time in her grown life, simply and wholly herself. And then, she said, if he was still of the same mind, and she rather thought she would be of hers, he might ask her again. And the Marquess of Stoneleigh, who understood her better than any man living, did not argue, and did not sulk, and did not press. He bowed his grave head, and said that a thing worth having was worth waiting for the right time to have it, and that he had spent his life learning to wait for the one true note and could surely wait one turning of the year for the truest. And he kissed her hand, and went home to the north, and wrote to her all that year, letters about the founding of bells and the art of the change, and the tuning of the partial tones, and by slow degrees about his heart, and she wrote back, and he waited, and kept faith, exactly as her father's bell had kept faith, for the year to come round. And here, before the year turns and I tell you how it ended, I will say the thing this whole story has been about. Because you have stayed all the way to her side and you have earned the saying of it plainly. They had taken everything from Aurelia Sandys that the world thinks can be taken. Her house, her fortune, her father's name, the work of her own hands, and at the last her very birth, the simple truth of who she was. And they had been able to take all of it, every piece, save one, for there was one thing they could not reach, and it was not hidden in the bell, though the proof of it was. The thing they could not take was the truth itself, the bare fact that she was her father's true-born daughter, that she had founded the great bell, that she was who she was. That fact sat in the world untouched all the 3 years they denied it, as a true thing sits untouched by any lie however loud, waiting only for the day someone would look closely enough, and listen to see it. They could burn the page that recorded the truth. They could not make the truth not so. They could bolt another man's name to the tower. They could not make him the founder. They could call her nobody for 3 years to a county that believed them. They could not make her nobody, not for one instant. And in the end the truth did the only thing the truth ever needs to do, which is to keep. It kept. In the dark crown of a bell and in the heart of a silent woman, through 3 long years of being denied, until the one day it was brought to the light, and then it spoke. To the whole county at once, in a dead man's founded words, and every lie built so cleverly against it simply ceased to stand. the way the dark ceases when you turn a thing up to the sun. That is the thing worth carrying away from Aurelia's story. Not that the wicked were punished, though they were. And not even that she was loved at last, though she was. But that a true thing well made, and well hidden, and faithfully kept, cannot in the end be unmade by any lie, but waits in the dark, patient as bronze, for the one day the light falls into it. The year turned, as years do, and the deep of winter came round again to Marchmont, and the great tenor bell, that Aurelia had labored over all that year with her own hands, in her own right, in her father's old foundry by the estate, had been brought true again, and hung once more in its place at the head of the ring. But she had given one particular and unalterable order concerning it, that the great brass founder's plate that had hidden the proofs in the crown was never again to be bolted fast, but left so that any who climbed to the bells might lift it and see the little empty chamber where her father had hidden her name, and that the cast legend in the inner crown, which had faced only heaven so long, should never be ground away, but that on the one day in every year that was the day her father had cast the bell, the great tenor should be lowered a little on its fittings and a lamp held up into its crown, that any who cared to climb the tower might read, in the late Earl's own founded words, the truth he had set there against the day his daughter should have need. And on a bright day that winter, when the great tenor rang out true and grand over the frozen fields for the first time in 4 years, the Marquess of Stoneleigh, who had kept faith and kept his distance and waited out the full turning of the year exactly as she had asked, came again to Marchmont, and this time he did not come to buy a bell. And this time the silent woman in the grey gown was nowhere to be found, for there was no longer any such person. There was only the Earl of Marchmont's daughter, the mistress of the house, in a well-made gown of soft blue, standing straight and unafraid in her own churchyard beneath the tower of her father's bells, waiting for him. And he crossed the green to her, and asked her again, as she had said he might, and she said yes. They were married in the spring, in the small old estate church beneath the very tower of the great ring, the register made whole again and her name written plain in it where it had always belonged. And old Ezra Pike, the faithful workman, stood near the front. And old Mr. Bramwell the solicitor, who had believed her when no one asked him to, and there was no one there who did not know, by then the whole story, of the Trueborn daughter called Nobody, and the cold Marquess who could not abide a lie, and the great bell that kept the truth in the dark of the tower until the one day it was brought to the light. She carried, at her wedding, no grand bouquet, but a single sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, in honor of the father who had founded her name into bronze where no lyre could reach it, and as she came out of the church on her husband's arm the great ring of Marchmont broke into a full glad peal above them, all 8 bells true and joyful, the deep tenor sounding the ground of them as her father had made it to do, rolling out over the whole county that had once believed she was nobody. And the 2 of them, the antiquary Marquess and the bell founder who was an earl's daughter, who had each thought themselves alone in a world that cared only for the show of things, were alone no longer, and they kept, between Marchmont and the great estate in the north, 2 of the finest and truest sets of bells in the kingdom, and worked at the founding and tuning of them together. 2 true makers keeping faith with the truth of made things. And in the fullness of time the line of Marchmont went on, true-born and unbroken, through the daughter they had tried so hard to make nobody. And the great ring of Marchmont rings out over the winter fields to this day, they say, the tenor sounding deep and true beneath the 7, with the little chamber in its crown kept ever unbolted, and the founded legend kept ever bare and read by lamplight once a year as its mistress ordered, to the end of her long life and beyond it. And on the one day in all the year that is the day the great bell was cast, the day her father founded her name into the bronze against the dark, the old people of the county will tell you, if you ask them, that the great tenor of Marchmont sounds a little prouder than on any other day, though that of course is only a fancy, for a bell speaks the same true note on every day alike. But it is a fancy worth keeping, I think, like the unbolted plate, for a bell that has once kept the truth so faithfully in the dark has surely earned the right to be thought, on the one day in the year it was made, to sound a little prouder. That was tonight's chapter from Candlelit Chapters. If her story moved you, snuff the candle gently and join me for the next.